the Community Technical Assistance Center and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center of New York State. Welcome to today's webinar, Legacies of Pain and Resilience, Clinical Implications for Understanding Historical Trauma and Race, presented by my extraordinary colleagues, Dr. James Rodriguez and Jason Jones. Today's webinar is a part of our 0 Degrees of Separation, the Role of Social Determinants series, so hopefully many of you have been participating in our other offerings. The McSilver Institute, CTAC, and MCTAC have partnered to launch this multi-platform online series intended to help clinical professionals, community health workers, educators, policymakers, and any and all who influence our healthcare system so that we can all begin to think critically about those social factors that have a direct and indirect impact on an individual's health and mental health. Throughout the series, we hope to bring into focus the linkage between poverty, racial disparities, and health inequities, and discuss ways in which these issues can be addressed to improve health and mental health outcomes for all. Today's topic, historical trauma, is an important consideration in that linkage between poverty, racial disparities, and health inequities. Historical trauma refers to psychological distress experienced by survivors of descendants of human-initiated acts of oppression. Today's webinar is intended to help clinicians understand historical trauma and provide some clarity regarding the intergenerational transmission of trauma and how it particularly relates to racial oppression. Our presenters will summarize the research on the biological, psychological, and social forces that promote an intergenerational legacy of pain and suffering among descendants of people impacted by traumatizing historical events. They will also outline the importance of resilience in helping individuals and communities recover and cope with historical trauma. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. I'm hopeful that many of you have participated with us before, so this is just a refresher. So upon joining the webinar, you are on mute to avoid any background noises, but you may raise your hand if you have a question. If you experience any technical issues during today's event, please chat to our WebEx host, Amanda, who will be able to assist you. We're going to leave a bit of time for questions and answers at the end, but please feel free to ask any questions you may have along the way. You could do this by utilizing the chat box feature, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's not visible, click the dialog bubble on the top right toolbar, and then it should appear. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will now hand it over to Jim and Jason to introduce themselves and to begin.
Thank you, Kara. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Rodriguez, and I'm a research scientist at McSilver Institute for Poverty, Policy, and Research, part of the Silver School of Social Work at NYU. I'm also a therapist specializing in children, adolescents, and families, and I'm adjunct faculty at the NYU School of Social Work. I teach courses in CBT and our Diversity, Racism, Oppression, and Privilege course. And I'd like to turn over to Jason to introduce himself. Jason?
Thanks, Jim. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Jones, and I'm a social worker here at the McSilver Institute and at the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. At McSilver, I serve as the co-chair of the Anti-Oppressive Steering Committee, where we work to acknowledge, analyze, and end oppressive and racist practices within our work. I'm very happy to share my thoughts with all of you here today and engage in this important discussion. Jim?
Great. So this topic is very near and dear to me because it combines my interests both as a therapist and an anti-oppressive, anti-racist practitioner, and a teacher of diversity and cultural competence in social work. I want to start by saying that the notion of historical trauma can be considered controversial in that at times it can be seen as a form of pathologizing whole groups of people, so that in discussing the effects of historical events such as the Holocaust or American slavery, it might be suggested that all members of the targeted group develop pathological ways of coping. This, of course, is not the case, but we believe that an understanding of historical trauma and its effects on current generations helps clinical professionals, policymakers, and our healthcare system in general to think critically about intergenerational trauma and its direct and indirect effects on health and mental health. And it can also help us to better understand the context of inequities in our system that exists today. Understanding historical trauma can help us to ensure that the systems in place to help members of targeted groups affected by those historical events are trauma-informed, non-racist, and non-oppressive. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to start by giving some historical context, which is a critical component of culturally competent practice. We will then clarify terminology, including details on the historical trauma response. We're going to outline some of the mechanisms that explain the intergenerational transmission of trauma, of historical trauma, and we will end with some considerations for a multi-level, multi-systems response to historical trauma in behavioral health systems. We're going to start with a poll question, and that's very simple. Do you ever discuss the impact of historical trauma in your work with clients? Please answer yes, A for yes, B for no, or C if you're unsure. And we'll take a minute just to see that. Okay, and it should take a second here to load up the results. It looks like we have a little less than half of folks who have discussions of historical trauma with their clients, a good number of no's, but a little less than half of the folks, and then a number of folks who have no answers. So there are discussions of historical trauma that do take place in your clinical work, and that's helpful to know moving forward, and hopefully that could lead to some good Q&A at the end regarding your own experiences with historical trauma in your clinical work. So I'm going to turn it over to Jason because he's going to sort of set the context and talk a little bit about what we refer to as traumas of human design.
Great, thanks, Jim. So we thought it would be important to talk a little bit about some of these historical circumstances and examples that we know of, specifically the ones where there's a lot of research around, to just frame our discussion for today. So throughout U.S. history and world history, there have been clear examples of large-scale events that have greatly traumatized specific cultural groups and had widespread historical and generational impacts. Examples include the Jewish Holocaust, African-American slavery, the American Indian Holocaust, including the Trail of Tears, and Japanese internment camps, as well as many others. Although many of these specific events took place decades ago, it is important for behavioral health providers and those of us in the helping professions to understand the context of these events to better assist those that we work with who are actively struggling with the effects of historical trauma. So when we talk about Japanese internment camps, just for a little bit of the history, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, race-based prejudice and fear spread throughout the country. In 1942, President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066, calling for all people of Japanese descent to relocate from the west coast of the U.S. to internment camps throughout the country. Over 120,000 people were ordered to relocate, most of whom were U.S. citizens. Families were forced to sell their property and move into one of the internment camps and remain there until 1945. The racism and subpar conditions that Japanese Americans were forced to endure led to long-lasting and intergenerational physiological and psychological effects. When we look at African-American slavery, although well documented, the historical impact and effects of the enslavement of African Americans often goes ignored. Slavery of black peoples was first introduced to what became the U.S. in 1619, and through the 17th and 18th centuries, slavery was the means by which economic stability, production were upheld in the country. Slavery was outlawed in 1865, but many states took time to release their slaves from captivity, creating laws and public codes to bar African Americans from equal rights and citizenship. Segregation, federal and state laws, the Jim Crow laws, and domestic acts of terrorism towards African Americans continued to plague Black communities for centuries to follow, seemingly culminating with the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. However, continued efforts to subjugate African Americans to unfair treatment and lower societal status, such as race-based policing, the prison industrial complex, and prohibitory housing policies have all contributed to historical and intergenerational trauma. Moving on, we all have an understanding of the Jewish Holocaust because it is one of the most well-documented historical cases of cultural and group-based trauma. Following the Nazi Party's rise to power in Germany in 1933, families and individuals of Jewish heritage and those that actively practiced Judaism were targeted and persecuted. Those who were not immediately killed were forced into concentration camps where they were subjected to torture, starvation, and other heinous acts. Of the 9 million practicing Jews in Germany during the time, 6 million were killed. Several were able to escape Nazi tyranny, but the stories and experiences lived on and passed from generation to generation. So when looking at the American Indian Holocaust, we're going to focus specifically on the Trail of Tears, which is one of the many race and culturally based acts against the indigenous peoples of America. Within President Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act, the Cherokee Nation was forced to relocate from all of their lands east of the Mississippi to what is present-day Oklahoma in 1838 and 1839. The journey was over 2,000 miles long and claimed over 4,000 deaths. However, the Trail of Tears is simply a part of the long-lasting and continued exclusion and mistreatment of the indigenous peoples of these lands. For all of the cultural groups mentioned and the many more that we have not mentioned, it is important to understand the significance of these events. Specifically, we need to understand their salience to the specified groups and individuals with whom we work. We need to understand how these historical acts have impacted their families and others within their cultural groups. And most importantly, we need to avoid forgetting or getting over what happened. Within the U.S., we have a long history of telling entire groups of people and others within the nation what to remember and what to forget. These messages are delivered through intimate conversations, subtle microaggressions, or overtly in mainstream media. The common theme throughout these messages is that when it comes to acts that oppress people of color and can be seen as a disgrace for the nation, they must be forgotten. But acts that encourage nationalism are often seen as those that we should band together around and remember. In other parts of the world, there is a great deal of acknowledgement for the oppression that people of color have faced within their own nations. Australia has called for a National Day of Healing, otherwise known as Sorry Day, to acknowledge the oppression that indigenous people faced. And in 2015, Pope Francis publicly apologized for the effects of colonialism that the indigenous people of Bolivia experienced. However, the U.S. often provides a different narrative. Next slide. Although the U.S. finally apologized for slavery and Jim Crow in 2008, these messages of forgetting and getting over what has and continues to happen are widespread, giving voice to those who wish to move on from the blemishes of our society while silencing those that these acts most impact. Simply put, refusing to validate the systemic and intergenerational impact of these traumas places blame on those who have to live with the trauma, as if the only problem is with them. As helping professionals, it is important for us to not only understand the historical context, but acknowledge its impact and validate the experiences of those that we work with. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jim to take us through the terminology that we'll need to frame our discussion. Jim?
Wonderful. Thank you, Jason. Of course, that was a wonderful summary of obviously some events that require so much more information. We underscore it because we're going to be looking at these events in particular, but of course there are many others. But we do want to underscore that part of our practice has to be located within a specific historical context, and understanding the history of trauma is critically important. So to talk a little little bit about, I'd like to start by defining the various types of trauma that there are. Okay, very simply, situational trauma is trauma that occurs as a result of a specific or discrete event. For example, a rape, a car accident, seeing someone killed, or getting caught in a natural disaster. This is a type of trauma that most mental health professionals typically address because it is known to the victim or survivor of the trauma and is the likely cause of the presenting problem or the focus of treatment in general. It's not often the case. Sometimes trauma becomes revealed as a course of treatment, but this is what is typical. Cumulative trauma can be, but is not necessarily, more subtle and less direct, stressful life events. They can be thought of as exposure to daily stressors that, although not traumatizing in isolation, can build over time. So examples of cumulative trauma include exposure to explicit racism and implicit racism, or microaggressions that Jason referred to earlier. Microaggressions being those verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, intentional or unintentional, that reflect hostility or insults towards members of a targeted group, such as women, people of color, members of the LGBT community, Jews, or Muslims. So these are things that occur on a daily basis. And then intergenerational trauma refers to untreated, inadequately, or unaddressed trauma that is passed down from one generation to the next through patterns of behavior and thought systems. In general, the research on intergenerational trauma is focused on parent-to-child transmission of trauma, so that a parent who is traumatized can traumatize their own child by being depressed or emotionally unavailable because of the trauma. And much of the research on historic trauma is actually based on intergenerational transmission processes. It's critical to understand that all three forms of trauma contribute to historical trauma. Historical trauma refers to the cumulative trauma over both the lifespan and across generations that results from massive catastrophic events of human design. They are the results of genocide, the effects of colonization, tribalism, dispossession, or dislocation. And it's critical to understand that the events that contribute to historical trauma share three components. The events are widespread among a specific group or population, with many group members being affected. The event is perpetrated by out-group members with purposeful and often destructive intent. And the event generates high levels of collective distress in victimized groups. In general, a traumatic response is an emotional state of discomfort resulting from memories of an extraordinary or catastrophic event that destroys the survivor's sense of vulnerability to harm. That's in general. What makes traumas of human design so much more damaging is that they can more deeply rock core beliefs that people have about themselves and other human beings, resulting in what Maria Braveheart, a Native American healer, refers to as a soul wound. It can lead people to have negative core beliefs that raise questions about the limits of human decency, raise questions about the limits of fairness and justice, and strip people of their culture and identity. And because the effects are so widespread within given groups, historical traumas also deeply diminish the ability of members of the targeted group to support and heal one another. These are some of the symptoms that comprise the historical trauma response of survivors, and also what is referred to as survivor's child complex. I've combined them here because there's so much overlap between the symptoms. These have been identified primarily through case studies with Holocaust survivors and their children, as well as Native American and Aboriginal Canadian survivors and children of survivors of Indian residential schools. On the left are some of the classic symptoms or associated features that clinicians might find with people affected by PTSD, such as anxiety, numbing, depression and withdrawal, survivor guilt, and unresolved grief. On the right are some of the symptoms that might be more specifically attributed to the historical trauma. Perceived obligations can sometimes be manifested as a need on the part of the children of survivors to identify with their survivor parents' pain. Compensatory fantasies can include fantasies of undoing the pain of historical trauma. Elevated mortality rates mortality rates are attributed to heightened rates of cardiovascular disease as well as suicides and accidental deaths from substance abuse. Other symptoms include identification with ancestral pain and intrusive historical imagery, both in survivors and the children of survivors. Here's a case example from the literature. Gloria is a 15-year-old Pueblo Indian girl referred to for a suicide attempt. This is her account of the triggers that led to her attempt. I just can't talk to my parents. I don't want to burden them with my problems and feelings. They have so much pain of their own. I just can't bring myself to do that. But I feel like I had no one to talk to. That's why I took those pills. I just felt so tired. I wish I could take away their pain. They have suffered so much themselves in boarding school. I'd like to go away to college, but I can't leave them. I feel so guilty, like I have to take care of them. Here you have a 15-year-old girl who was pushed to suicide by her struggle to remain silent of her own pain as she tried to protect her parents from theirs. This is such a clear example of the historical trauma response, which highlights how the Native American Indian experience of historical trauma is thought of as both a source of the intergenerational transmission of trauma as well as a potential positive factor for the kind of long-term distress experienced by large numbers of Native Americans, as demonstrated by higher rates of suicide, substance abuse, domestic violence, and early death. In the last decade, there's been quite a bit of research and literature on historical and intergenerational trauma. However, in my unsystematic review of the literature for this presentation, I was shocked to see that there is very little, if no attention paid to the historical trauma associated with slavery and Jim Crow. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to go through the possible reasons for this omission, but luckily, Dr. Joy DeGruy, the author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, fills this gap pretty well. First, Dr. DeGruy defines post-traumatic slave syndrome mathematically as the sum of multi-generational trauma. By this she refers to, of course, the 250 years of chattel slavery in the United States combined with oppression via Jim Crow laws, plus the absence of opportunity, both real and imagined, that to access to benefits available to all members of society as demonstrated by substandard schools and high dropout rates and mass incarceration rates. So these two things, multi-generational trauma plus absence of opportunity, equals post-traumatic slave syndrome. The syndrome is largely based on the belief systems that have developed over time as a result of slavery and ongoing oppression. Very consistent with the tenets of the cognitive revolution, Dr. DeGruy finds that beliefs are pivotal for understanding human behavior. Of course, we know that they color our ideas about the world and ourselves. They influence the way we think and feel from moment to moment, and they influence our memories of the past and help to form visions for our future. Dr. DeGruy describes three distinct symptoms of post-traumatic slave syndrome: vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and racist socialization. With regard to vacant esteem, according to Dr. DeGruy, she considers esteem to run along a continuum from healthy to unhealthy and defines vacant esteem as the state of believing oneself to have little or no value. Vacant esteem can result from three sources: the family, the community, and society. Families can transmit vacant esteem when parents or elders perceive little or no value for themselves. So this is consistent with the idea of intergenerational transmission through parental mental health. This can also be established through long-standing child-rearing and parenting practices that promote extreme compliance, a remnant of slavery and Jim Crow. Communities can transmit vacant esteem through the standards and values regarding acceptable behavior, educational attainment, and professional possibilities. We're all aware, of course, of the historical inequities of separate but equal laws, which clearly created separate pipelines for white and black children in our society. These practices continue today with where higher education is oftentimes expected or even taken for granted for more privileged white communities, while African American children rarely have this expectation. A good example of this is black children being pushed into vocational education programs instead of college tracks. Lastly, society promotes vacant esteem through its laws, policies, institutions, and the media. probably the greatest example of societal devaluation of African Americans is the Black Lives Matter movement and the more general concerns about inequities in the criminal justice system. Now, signs of vacant esteem include suicide. Dr. DeGruy takes the broad interpretation of suicide to include both explicit attempts to harm or kill oneself, as well as the many other forms of high-risk behavior that African Americans, especially young African American men, engage in that can certainly lead to death, such as gang involvement. Although rates of suicide among blacks is lowest among all ethnic and racial groups in America, you see here in the bar graph increasing suicide rates in the last decade among young African American males. Even more consistent with Dr. DeGruy's work is research that suggests that one risk factor for suicide among African American youth is perceived racism and discrimination, along with economic disadvantage that leads to a sense of hopelessness. To explain ever-present anger, Dr. DeGruy starts with the simplest and largely agreed-upon cause for anger as the emotional response to block goals. This is not only accepted by most lay people and many psychologists, but also a central tenet of Buddhist philosophy predating modern psychology. Dr. DeGruy sees ever-present anger resulting from the broken promises of American society that were inherent in the practices of slavery. American society is built upon a set of principles regarding freedom, equality, and justice for all that simply has been viewed by many in the African community as a set of lies that have repeatedly blocked them from opportunities for prosperity. Even today, African American families continue to face many indignities resulting from blocked opportunities for success in society, including de facto segregation in schools, glass ceilings for African American professionals, discriminatory bank lending policies and practices, discriminatory renting practices, redlining, and gentrification. These and other social policies and practices are the basis of what we refer to as systemic racism that lead to poverty and economic inequality, poor educational outcomes, and poor health and mental health outcomes. Here you see the increasing racial disparities in income between whites and blacks in America. Just one of many indicators of economic disparity that exists today. I would add here that microaggressions, as we've already stated, can be considered an additional source of ever-present anger, although they can also contribute heavily to vacant esteem. Lastly, racist socialization, according to Dr. DeGruy, is probably the most direct legacy of slavery that continues today. My read of racist socialization is that it appears to be similar to a combination of the legacy of internalized racism and Stockholm Syndrome. It refers to the tendency of those held in captivity to take on, internalize, and in some ways idealize characteristics of their captors. This can be manifested in a variety of ways, including the tendency to idealize and adopt white standards of beauty in hair texture and skin color, of course. Here we see a picture of Sammy Sosa, who, although not African American, he's from the Dominican Republic, very clearly demonstrates this idealization of white skin through his admitted use of skin bleaching treatment. Dr. DeGruy notes that during slavery, lighter-skinned slaves, the product of rape of black female slaves by their owners, were most often elevated in the slave hierarchy and brought into the owner's home as house slaves. They were also resold at slave auctions for higher sums. I might add that another indicator of racist socialization might include the tendency of some African American youth to overcompensate in response to the idealization of whites and steadfastly reject their peers based on peers' internalization of white standards. So, for example, African American youth making fun of their peers who speak standard English or pursue higher educational attainments as a form of acting white. I'd like to turn now to some of the mechanisms that explain this historical trauma transmission, intergenerational transmission of historical trauma. The intergenerational transmission of historical trauma is a very complex process, but these are some of the mechanisms that I would like to address today. This is not an exhaustive list of mechanisms, but certainly some basic and fundamental processes. Conspiracy of silence that can keep people from addressing trauma, biological and physiological mechanisms of transmission, which include a growing body of research, and psychosocial mediators like attachment security, emotional regulation, availability, and parenting. Let me read this quote by Elie Wiesel. Had we started to speak, we would have found it impossible to stop. Having shed one tear, we would have drowned the human heart. So invincible in the face of death and the enemy, we now felt helpless. We were mad with disbelief. People refused to listen, to understand, to share. There was a division between us and them, between those who endured and those who read about it, or would refuse to read about it. We thought people would remember our experiences, our testimony, and manage to suppress their violent impulses to kill or hate. This quote by Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, author, and unrelenting advocate for remembering, reflects that the period just after the end of World War II, when, according to researchers, psychiatry and psychoanalysis tended to neglect the psychological adjustments of survivors in favor of physical and material support. Eventually, studies by Bergman and Jacobi and others began to explore and understand the mechanisms of intergenerational transmission of trauma of Holocaust survivors. But regardless of research, Elie Wiesel was always concerned with the problem of forgetting historical traumas, because forgetting can only interfere with healing, both for individuals as well as society as a whole. So we as clinicians, as anyone who works with victims of trauma knows, forgetting or attempts to forget the trauma often lead to the symptoms that people need relief from. Yael Danieli refers to this as the conspiracy of silence, and it is reviewed here as one of the mechanisms that contributes to the ongoing legacies of pain. Here's another quote. A lot of times you assume that your parents do not have a past when you're little, and because you live in the present so much. The older I got, I would ask more about their lives, how they got married, how they met. Through those discussions of camp were conspicuously absent, so I never really learned about the camps through my parents. I got bits and pieces, never a coherent story. This quote is from the descendant of an American-born Japanese internee, clearly describes the dangers of silence. The Japanese internment has been described as the greatest deprivation of civil liberties by government in this country since slavery. The Sansei Research Project was a study of the descendants of Japanese internees. Sansei were the children of internees born after the war whose parents were interned. And just for context, Nisei are second-generation Japanese Americans who were already citizens of the United States at the time of internship. And then Issei were the first-generation Japanese immigrants that were detained as well. To be clear, internees included almost every Japanese and Japanese American citizen in the United States, regardless of citizenship. Aside from the trauma of relocation that included loss of freedom, poor living conditions, loss of property, and other severe economic loss, and the loss of social networks, Japanese internment also resulted in some critical culturally based trauma, including the undoing of family structures and the questioning of Japanese loyalty. This was depicted so amazingly in the recent Broadway play, Allegiance, if anyone had a chance to see it. The breakdown of the Japanese nuclear family structure was achieved by mess hall meal times that interfered with traditional family dinners, by separating elders from the younger members, and more importantly, elevating younger Japanese to positions of authority over their elders. But at an even more fundamental level, the internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans was an assault on their identities. You see, loyalty is a highly valued trait in Japanese culture. To question their loyalty is one of the, if not the most severe psychological assault that can be inflicted on the character and identity of someone of Japanese descent, and certainly a critical reason for the shame and silence experienced by Japanese internees and their descendants. Research suggests that one of the effects of internment was the impact on interned Nisei's physical health and the health of their children, and particularly males. For example, data from the Sansei Research Project showed that among Sansei, those children of American-born Japanese who were interned there were more than twice as many whose fathers were in camp died before the age of 60, compared to Sanseis whose fathers were not interned. These were the silent sufferers, and I think it would not be hyperbole to say that many of these sensei literally died of shame. I should also note here that the conspiracy of silence also refers to the silence about slavery in our society, as Jason alluded to in the introduction to this talk, which is also reinforced in the lack of research on intergenerational trauma in the African-American community. From a psychoanalytic perspective, Auer and Laub described traumatic memories as existing along a continuum of psychological distance from the traumatic event, with more conscious knowing being more adaptive. These forms of traumatic memory are all relevant for a full understanding of the intergenerational transmission of historical trauma. Not knowing, the first form of traumatic memory, occurs at the time of traumatic exposure. These are memories that are not allowed to enter into the conscious by the triggering of defense mechanisms such as denial, repression, or splitting, or the experiencing of various dissociative states such as derealization or depersonalization. Here is an example from our analog of Bessie K., who was a Holocaust survivor who provided videotape testimony of her camp experience. In her testimony, Bessie K. recalled how she attempted to hide her baby in her coat while German guards were separating men, women, and children before forcing them into cattle trains. Bessie said, "But the baby was short of breath, started to choke, and it started to cry. So the German called me back. He said in German, 'What do you have there?' Now I didn't know what to do because everything was so fast and everything happened so suddenly. I wasn't prepared for it. To look back, the experience was, I think I was numb, or something happened to me. I don't know, but I wasn't there. And he stretched out his arms. I should hand him over the bundle. And I hand him over the bundle, and this is the last time I had the bundle." Soon after this third concentration camp, she met the doctor who, in the ghetto before her deportation, had operated on an infected breast. She commented, and when the doctor, saw me, she was so happy to see me, and right away she says, "What happened? Where's the baby? What happened to the baby?" And right there I said, "What baby?" I said to the doctor, "What baby? I didn't have a baby. I don't know of any baby." Survivors in this state are stripped of memories of loved ones, but also of autobiographical memories that form our identities. This kind of phenomena is also seen in victims of childhood abuse who eventually become abusers themselves. With screen memories, some Holocaust survivors had to give up familial, ethnic, and religious identities to survive and cope with the Holocaust. In some cases, these led to the creations of alternative and possibly false identities that were superimposed on the psyche in the absence of complete memories. This kind of trauma can be transmitted to children of survivors in the form of incomplete stories or sanitized accounts. Fugue states sort of not knowing and screen memories involve either the disappearance or disconnection from traumatizing events. Other forms of remembering, such as fragments of memories, involve intrusive thoughts or parts of thoughts, feelings and behaviors associated with the traumatic event. From an object relations lens, when fragmented memories are enacted on current relationships, transference phenomena occur. Survivors of traumatic events often pass these traumatic graphs in one of two ways. Survivors can often lead their lives consistent with such transferences when they use parenting practices that attempt to have their children behave the same way. For example, self-control or discipline was critical, although not always, for survival in concentration camps. This was similar for African Americans in the antebellum South and in Jim Crow South. Dropped food, an untied shoelace, looking or not looking at a camp guard or a white person could be met with severe punishment or death. In response, survivors can communicate messages, and children of survivors of historical trauma can inherit these messages that life is hard, openness is to be discouraged, discipline must be harsh. Up until now, the first forms of knowing can be viewed as only marginally or not at all available to the conscious mind. Overpowering narratives, these refer to more types of trauma that we might normally work through in therapy, situational traumas that are vivid and clear and intrusive. The individual is stuck with images that they can sometimes ignore, but can sometimes come at any time during the day or visit them at night in the form of nightmares. For survivors of historical trauma, these painful memories can be brought into the present moment and paradoxically destroy their ability to be present. Children of survivors often experience the loss of a primary object, which can lead to depressive states. Overpowering narratives lead to life themes, which can be adaptive or negative. These can include ways of coping in response to the fragmented transference phenomena described above. The witness narrative represents true memories of the traumatic event in detail. These are the kinds of memories that can be developed in the course of treatment. Trauma as a metaphor refers to memories that can become more vivid and clear than witness narratives, but can also be represented and interpreted through free associations and more fully integrated into the person's psyche. And lastly, action knowledge represents knowledge of the traumatic event that leads to action against oppression. It involves knowing facts and then choosing to act upon those facts. Another mechanism, so in addition to the conspiracy of silence and formation of memories, there is a growing body of research on the biological and psychosocial mechanisms, most importantly the parenting environment that transmit trauma from generation to generation. I placed them here together because they're so interrelated. We know that the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis regulates cortisol release. This is a normal physiological response to stress, and it's adaptive. This axis is activated in dangerous situations and is necessary to prepare a person for flight or fight. However, when a person is constantly stressed or affected by traumatic events, an unhealthy overproduction of cortisol can take place, and the person may become even more sensitive to stressful events, or may come to see all situations as threatening. Regardless of whether threats are real or not, the body reacts the same, which can ultimately lead to dysfunction in this axis. These problems with cortisol production, overproduction, or underproduction are associated with psychiatric disorders, including both depression and anxiety, as well as a number of stress-related health disorders. We also know from the adverse child event studies that they've demonstrated long-term negative physical and mental health consequences of early childhood exposure to trauma. In addition, research shows that early childhood exposure to trauma leads to long-term dysfunction in the HPA axis in adult survivors or victims of trauma. So with respect to historical trauma and cortisol, it's important to understand some of the research. Rachel Yehuda has found an association between cortisol dysregulation in trauma survivors and their adult offspring. Specifically, she has found this relationship in the adult offspring of Holocaust survivors and also in the babies of parents exposed to the World Trade Center disaster. There are questions about the stability or reversibility of the systems that regulate cortisol production, with some of the research suggesting that dysregulation in cortisol production can be reversed, which is a good sign for interventionists. This reversibility may explain why our trauma treatments work and why principles of trauma-informed care are being seen as an effective approach to delivering mental health and substance abuse treatment services. I should also note here that here at the CTAC, we've recently completed a series on trauma-informed care webinars that are accessible on the CTAC website. It should also be obvious by now that these biological mechanisms of transmission could interfere with the parenting environment in at least 3 ways. Parents can simply pass along the risk of problems with the HPA axis biologically. Again, this does not mean that it's irreversible. Secondly, if both the mother and the child are having difficulty regulating themselves, this can lead to various types of insecure attachments and shared trauma experiences. These insecure attachments can lead to parenting styles that may rely on harsh discipline, child abuse, emotional and physical neglect, and early childhood trauma. Taking this research into account, it shouldn't be a huge leap to see how this cycle could be triggered by historical events that expose large groups of people to chronic trauma. I want to end with some therapeutic considerations. When we think about historical trauma, it's important to note that historical trauma, when addressed and treated, can lead to positive and adaptive coping and healing for the individual and society. It's also important to note that, as with any form of trauma, there is always the variability in trauma response, especially in response to mass traumatic events such as 9/11, disaster, natural disasters. The vast majority of people who survive cope well and adapt. There's no reason to believe it's different with historical trauma. However, for people who may suffer ongoing effects of historical trauma, we have some general recommendations for treatment and services that can help people adapt and build resilience. The first note there, therapeutic factors and cultural competence. The first line, TAU with an anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens. That refers to treatment as usual. Treatment as usual with an anti-oppressive, anti-racist lens refers to treatment that practitioners can continue using treatment approaches they feel most comfortable with, but to develop an anti-racist and anti-oppressive lens that accounts for the history of trauma associated with racism and oppression that informs the core beliefs of members of targeted groups in sometimes direct and subtle ways. It's important for clinicians to explore expressive histories, or at the very least acknowledge their reality. This may be crucial to helping clients make connections that they might normally make on their own. Remember Gloria, the Pueblo Indian girl who tried to commit suicide. Knowledge of historical trauma should clearly lead a clinician to explore that traumatic past with Gloria and to consider using the stressful event of suicide to include her parents in care as well. Being aware of TIBs. To use a DBT term, TIBs refer to therapy interfering behaviors. Here what I'm referring to is countertransferences that may manifest as tendencies to avoid fear or discussion of race and trauma. Culturally competent care in relation to historical trauma means that clinicians are not only open to discussions about race and trauma, but actively seek opportunities to discuss issues of race and oppression inherent in historical trauma. The second bullet point there, socio-cultural approaches to trauma. To echo the words of Elie Wiesel, remember, never forget. This is an important sentiment to bring into our work with clients. We should be all willing and able to fight oppression and become allies, and acknowledge and confront historical trauma in the community. Some culturally specific approaches to working through historical trauma include helping clients connect to their sense of self that derives meaning from membership to their social group. Remember, historical trauma can strip individuals of their cultural identity. Helping clients reconnect with all aspects of their cultural history, trauma-related or not trauma-related, can be an important goal in therapy. This can include exploring issues of racial, ethnic, and religious identity, and are helping clients connect to their culture. It also involves assessing and exploring your clients' understanding of the historical context and the salience of race in their lives, and helping them develop new narratives in their lives and more healthy ways of coping. This may include helping to connect with local spiritual healing services or people from the person's community who are more connected to the culture of the individual's group. Approaches in the Native American and Aboriginal communities developed by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart include trauma-informed clinical interventions that apparently focus on teaching indigenous forms of healing. I want to end with a quote of one of the participants in Maria Braveheart's work. This is from an Algonquin counselor. Teaching women to get grounded. There's a woman who came to see me a few years ago. Sometimes when she would talk about her sexual violence in her childhood, we would do some visualization. She didn't like me to call them that, so we just called it that thing we do. That thing we do was about bringing her to a lake and washing herself off, like washing the child, drying her off, using the light from the Creator, the heat from the Creator's light to dry her, and then to get her to dress in her regalia and put on her little moccasins and her hair pieces. She had them in her hair daily, but she would put them on this little girl that she was taking care of, which was her or her spirit. It was definitely her spirit that she was caring for. I want to end there and open it up for questions and answers in the limited time that we have available. I want to thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez and Jason. I'm so sorry. Dr. Rodriguez and Jason, thank you so much. So we do have a few questions, if I could just share them with you. Someone had asked about having some guidance on how to engage in an historically based assessment. Do we have any samples of that, or do you have any recommendations there?
Yeah, you know, in doing this research, there wasn't a lot. However, there is, and I could make it available, someone who is developing a historical trauma inventory. It is focused, I believe, in the Native American and Aboriginal communities of Canada, but I can certainly make it available. There's not a lot, however. There's no formal assessment. I was actually very surprised to see in reviewing this literature, I really only found the one measure that has been developed. And again, as I said, I could make it available and put it on the CTAC, and it refers to historical trauma and loss scale. But very little else. Again, my review was not exhaustive, and I could look at more. I was also very surprised by the fact that there wasn't that much in the with Holocaust survivors, although there is currently, recently, there was developed a historical trauma scale for Holocaust survivors that focused on different adaptational styles. So actually, I correct myself. There was a second measure that I found.
Okay. Thank you. So could we post that link on our website or some
Absolutely.
information on our website for people to get? That would be great. Our slides will be available. We're getting a lot of questions about the slides, and they will be available later today or tomorrow at ctacny.com. We have a new website. Hopefully you will enjoy it, and the slides will be there under trainings. And one more question. Someone was really struck by the slide around the suicide rates of Black boys and how it has risen so much, and they were wondering, do you know if it's because in 2003, I guess they started including suicide-related things like gang involvement, or is that the actual suicide rate? They were really shocked to see it in a graph. Do you have any more information there?
I don't, but I can look it up. That graph was from the Society for the Prevention of Suicide, which is a pretty reputable society, so I'm sure the research is tight. I would agree with you. My guess is that that's probably the case by expanding the definitions. And I would say, though, again, sort of as a clinician, I'm sure many clinicians would agree, and much of the literature suggests that we do need to begin to broaden that definition of suicide to include those kinds of responses.
Thank you. Wonderful. And then the last question I have, unless others want to chat in, well, we have one. Can you provide the specific research reference that provides evidence of cortisol dysregulation in survivors of historical trauma?
Absolutely. As I said, there are a couple of studies that have been done, and frankly, many of the studies get into a much greater detail on the mechanisms, the genetic mechanisms. But I can certainly provide that. When I upload the slides, what I'll do is I will add a bibliography to the slides before they're uploaded. Would that be possible, Kara? Or can I put that separately?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we can add it to the slide. That's a great idea.
Yeah. But again, once again, I think one of the main researchers in that area is Rachel Yehuda, who's done that research on Holocaust. She's done a number of studies on historical trauma with Holocaust survivors, and more recently, as I said, with World Trade Center, survivors of the World Trade Center attack.
Okay, so we will add a page to the slides around resources for everyone to get this valuable information. Okay, I think we have one last question. Can you address compounded trauma as a result of being in the intersection of multiple groups who experience historical trauma?
I think I get most of that question, except for the multiple groups. Can I take that to mean intersectionality and issues of multiple social group participation? If so, I don't know. I'm not really clear, but and if the person could sort of chat that.
Can you
clarify? Yeah.
That's great. If you could chat in some clarifying information around your question, we'd love to attend to it. I was thinking it was the intersectionality as well, but it would be great to clarify.
Right. And again, I should note, though, that as you can see from this webinar, Jason and I really tried to integrate what we know about the research across all these groups. It's amazing to see that there's a lot of new research and new knowledge in this area being put out there, but at the same time, it is still limited to these very distinct groups and historical events. And so we kind of integrated what we know from all of these different events. And there are more, of course. There are other forms of mass trauma that are out there, historical trauma that are out there, and more information available. We just pull these. Yeah.
Which is why we're so grateful that you're even doing this presentation, so that we can continue the conversation. Somebody chatted in. This is a very good discussion. One of the things we are looking at is that service providers as people should look at what they have been taught about people of color. Intergenerational racism, stereotypes, and many other aspects of society could influence people to think that dealing with trauma is a responsibility of the communities impacted, but providers need to review their own perspectives, biases, and preconceived ideas about people who are different. A self-reflection of what we think about others is also needed. So thank you so much for that comment. I think that is really part of what we were hoping to attend to today. Did you have any thoughts, Jason or Jim?
Yeah, I would just say, yeah, thank you so much for that comment. I think that we at McSilver and at CTAC definitely agree with that, that on the part of the clinician or helping professional, it definitely starts with addressing your own internal biases. And I would say that I hope that you can check out the rest of the Race and Trauma series, because we really try to go into that, addressing your own internal biases, addressing microaggressions, and things of that nature. But the work is, it does start out individually, and it needs to continue throughout that process. So thank you.
Yeah, and really reflecting on critically how we've all been racially socialized is a big part of that work as well. So thank you, Jason, and thank you for that awesome comment. So back to the question about, I think this is our last one, about how can you address compounded trauma as a result of being in the intersection. This person was saying, yes, it is the intersectionality for those persons who may be Black and queer in particular.
Yeah, and as I said, I mean, there's, I haven't found that, but of course, I mean, those kinds of conflicts can obviously create a great deal of tension and compound the problem in terms of, and certainly, of course, would be as we've discussed, a focus of treatment, if necessary, in disentangling those intersectionalities.
So what we're talking about on some level is a different form or another component of complex trauma.
Yeah. Well, this is all a component of complex trauma. This is all a complex, and that just adds yet another layer of complexity to an already complex, compounded trauma response.
Yeah. That sounds good. So we're going to add some good resources for everyone, and we really appreciate your participation today. It was great to chat with many of you on the side and really get your thoughts and feelings about this work. And a special thanks to you, Dr. Jim Rodriguez, and you, Jason Jones. You're both so incredible, and we really appreciate all the work that you do. And thank you for everyone attending today's webinar. If you do have any other questions, please contact us at ctac.info@nyu.edu. You can attend to them. So once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you could complete that and provide your feedback, because it really does help us to continue this important work. Were you going to say something, Jim?
Well, I was going to say I would very much appreciate some feedback and thoughts about how we could follow up this particular topic.
Yep. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and for your thoughts. And thank you, presenters, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Until next time.
Take care.